Hey everyone, welcome back to Canton Insiders, the quick podcast series by Catholics by Intellect to You, where we go inside the Canton Network to see how it actually works and who is building on it. And in terms of building today, I've got Gustav from Zenith Foundation or Zenith Network. We will find out later, but he's the head of ecosystem at Zenith, which is the EVM execution layer for Canton Network. And before Zenith, he spent years in DeFi space, so he's one of the few people that actually worked on both sides of this conversation. Gustav, thanks for hopping in. Let's get into it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about what we are doing at Zenith and why we think it matters so much. Let's start.
Yeah, Zenith has been on top of the Canton conversation for, I think, since your launch from the Steels mod in March. But before diving deep into that, I would like to hear about your journey to Zenith. So you spent the better part of the decade in the DeFi space, so MakerDAO, 1inch, and other projects. And what pulled you towards the Ethereum, Canton, and now Zenith?
Yeah, so basically, I started my full-time crypto journey in 2018 when I joined Maker back in kind of like those earlier days. When I joined, there was around 40 million DAI in circulation. By the time I left, it was around kind of like 10 billion. It was like the peak DeFi summer state. So it was kind of like a very interesting journey, joining kind of like a DeFi protocol that was, essentially, one of the first, if a lot of people credit with being kind of like the first real DeFi protocol on the Ethereum side. And the reason why I joined them, I was living in Argentina at the time. I got paid in pesos, and was kind of like subject to the inflation of the peso. So, like crypto at that point was really something I started to use, in my kind of like daily life as like a way to get in and out of pesos. So, when the opportunity came around with like a DeFi protocol that, had a stable coin that was issued in a way where it was, kind of like this, like, unbiased currency. For me, it was extremely interesting, right? It was, kind of like a way to work with an alternative to the traditional financial system, right? And I think like what really was kind of like my dream back then, which I think today still is still very relevant, was kind of like this idea that like depending on where you are, where you're born, you will have like vastly different opportunities from like a financial standpoint. And DeFi kind of like presented itself as this like alternative, global alternative to the traditional financial systems, which are very kind of like regional. So that was kind of like the things that went through my mind when I joined back then. And I would also say that like my time with Maker, I did work quite a bit with institutions already back then. So like when SocGen, which is one of the largest French banks, did their project with MakerDAO, that was kind of like my project that I brought in, and I was going to Paris to talk with them on like a regular basis. So kind of like already had some of the institutional conversations back then. Um, and the same at 1inch. At 1inch, I was leading the institutional product, and that was kind of like the next step in my journey. I think like back then, one of the issues was that like the regulatory climate was not really in a position where we could really onboard institutions in like a good way. And then for the last 4 years, I've been running like my own company called StableLab. We're one of the largest governance service providers. We also build some governance related data products. And I had a team of 30 people there. However, when the administration changed, basically governance went a bit out of the window, which then led me to late last year shut down the company, and then kind of like look for what I was doing next. And then I talked with the Zenith team and really like kind of like the idea and the vision. I think for me, I knew already back in like my early days at Maker that kind of like institutional adoption would come one day. And I think now we are like really in a position where for the first time, like institutions are like seriously looking at the technology, not just for something to do a pilot, or you're not like an innovation department somewhere where some people think that what you're doing is cool, but you're actually like kind of like in the state where you potentially can fully onboard these institutions to actually, leverage the technology for parts of their business. So for me, it was like a very exciting opportunity. It kind of like pulled together two of the things that I'm quite passionate about. Like one of them is of course, like I've been part of like the Ethereum ecosystem for like a very long time. And we built a lot of amazing technology, and then being able to leverage all of this technology with these institutions getting onboarded into the Canton ecosystem. That was like a very nice kind of like match for me. So that was basically, where I then saw like the opportunity. So now I'm here.
I know that you've been with Zenith not for a long time, but
Yeah.
still, can you share some the origin story behind the Zenith? So I really like the position and approach, bring your Ethereum apps to Canton. So how this idea even came to life, and did you face
Yeah.
any challenges bringing it to life?
Yeah. So I mean, I've only been with the team for like a bit more than a month and a half now. I would say though that it feels a bit like coming home because I know most of the projects we're talking with already, and so I kind of like was able to hit the ground
Mm.
running, which was quite nice. And then like in terms of Zenith, like the team has a pretty interesting story because they basically were one of the first teams to fully prove the Ethereum history from a transactional standpoint, and basically worked closely with the Ethereum Foundation, worked closely with a lot of the L2s. But basically, in the end, they was kind of like becoming experts in these EVMs, and I think that like led quite naturally to like the thought of like, hey, we're experts in this. We've done it really well now. We're working with all of these amazing teams, um, but we could deploy something ourselves, and then basically they started talking with teams that needed EVM environments. One of the founders of Zenith was a big fan of Canton already then. So they started talking with the Canton team who was like, yes, we need this. So of course, like the infrastructure in Canton is quite different compared to what we are used to from public blockchains because of the privacy and these things that makes it an amazing place for institutions. But of course, like kind of like fully redeploying like a protocol that you've had on an EVM environment is can be quite tricky. So therefore, kind of like having the EVM environment directly integrated there would be like a massive kind of like much easier lift for the teams to then come in. So that was basically like a little bit like how the idea started taking place. And of course, today we are contributing a lot to the Canton ecosystem and the network, and we are targeting our launch in Q3. So once we go live, then that will be like really exciting to see all of these new possibilities coming onto Canton.
Yeah, excited to see Zenith go live, and yeah, for me, it feels like on the paper, it sounds logical and simple. So Canton is built for institutions, Ethereum and then Solana, they're built for kind of open innovation and more suited for the DeFi space. And can you describe, like, on the paper, it's simple, but how does Zenith makes these two worlds composable? So without bridges, without rewrites,
Yeah,
without
yeah.
compromises on something.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, like what I think is quite revolutionary about Zenith compared to like when we think of, let's say, L2s in the Ethereum ecosystem, is that we have built this new primitive, which is kind of like basically allowing for atomic composability between Canton and Zenith. So this basically means that if you have an asset living on Canton, you can like in one transaction bridge it to Zenith, use it in DeFi. So you can use it as collateral, take out a loan,
Hmm.
swap the loan to something else, and then be back to Canton in the same transaction. So basically what this allows to do is that it allows kind of like composability directly on the network level between Canton assets and Zenith DeFi applications. Um, yeah, like of course, like our approach to it in that sense, is I think it's like what L2s and these kind of like scaling solutions on Ethereum was kind of like supposed to achieve. But yeah, we've actually like managed to implement this here. So I think this will kind of like open a lot of new possibilities because you can have assets in this like compliant environment, and then when you bridge across to Zenith, what's happening on the Zenith side is all of these like amazing DeFi protocols, and then we can still be back in like the fully compliant environment on Canton.
Yeah, Absolutely. And yeah, this opens a lot of possibilities. And when I reached out to your team, they said that you're kind of one of the responsibilities at what you're doing at Zenith is bringing tier one DeFi teams to Canton. So yeah, maybe from the insider point of view, what convinces the DeFi team that has lived for a long time on Ethereum or Solana for years that the Canton should be kind of their next move?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, right? And I think like if we look at kind of like the evolution of the space in the last like let's say like 5 6 years, right? It has been like quite retail dominated in parts of the cycles with kind of like the DeFi summer, the NFT boom was like very retail heavy, and of course also the meme coin boom. But when these things have kind of like dwindled down, like retail is just, not necessarily like, that excited about crypto right now, but the
Yeah.
institutions are, right? So if we
Hmm.
go into like kind of imagine, you sit in like the strategy room of like a big DeFi protocol, L1, L2, right? I can almost guarantee you, there's not that many guarantees in life, but I can almost guarantee you that all of them have been talking about like, okay, how do we bring on institutions to use our protocol? So like a lot of the DeFi teams and a lot of the applications are either working on or have already launched institutionally focused parts of their platform. So I think like it's kind of like, this realization as well that okay, on these like public networks, there are some institutions, but it's not really like this big frenzy where all of them want to come on, right? It's still not that many. Where on Canton, of course, they've done exceptionally well with this. They really managed to onboard like a lot of institutions, a lot of institutional interest, and their enterprise sales team is amazing. The best we've ever seen. So but then of course there's kind of like this like I would say a little bit of a hurdle with if you've already built something with a specific architecture in an EVM environment, this doesn't just translate naturally into the Canton DAML environment. So basically Zenith then becomes kind of like the perfect medium for them, right? They are able to interact with Canton applications. All our transactions settles to Canton. We have this atomic composability. So even though we are, kind of like a newer chain launching, right? Like a newer network launching, there's like a lot of interest because a lot of them see the potential, the possibilities that Zenith will unlock in terms of like what they can do with institutions. So yeah, I think that's basically kind of like what is driving like a lot of the interest is that there was already on all of these teams roadmap to say, hey, we need to work with institutions. And then we come with kind of like the perfect platform for them to do that. So I think that's really like what is, helping us in like the conversations on like the EVM side.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the main focuses was for Canton Foundation and all the other members of the Canton Foundation to bridge the gap between institutions and DeFi. And Zenith platform seems to be a really great and huge contributor to this. So we are pretty excited to see your upcoming launch in 2026. So yeah, it's scheduled for this year. And I wanted to ask that you kind of emerged from the stealth mode, as I mentioned, this March. So already when the top institutions been joining, when the Canton was accelerating, I'm not that long in the Canton space as well. So it's been half a year. But yeah, I also see almost every week some huge, massive banger updates. And
Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to ask you from your point of view, how do you see Canton evolving from here? Maybe if there are any particular use cases you personally or you as a representative of the Zenith team would like to see on Canton.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we know that there's like a really big pipeline of asset issuers in sizes and maturity levels, but like of course there's kind of like a little bit what we've seen before, which is like the smaller teams, but also like really big companies looking to do asset issuance on Canton, right? So, basically what I really want to do and what I really want to showcase is like our ability to use the DeFi rails and technology to facilitate various use cases with these types of institutions. So I think that like what the DeFi rails enable is like a different access to the market, more efficiency around like some of the primary use cases for these types of assets. So That's really like what I'm focused on, is like how do I bring in like all the right verticals and use cases so we can start really pushing some of these like institutional DeFi use cases forward. So I think this is what I'm like very excited about. I think that's just, for example, now the DTCC, they just announced that they're going to be issuing like native treasuries on Canton, for example, right? Where like on Ethereum, we have a lot of tokenized treasuries, which basically means that it's often, some kind of like third party setup that holds the treasuries off chain, and then they issue like a representation on chain. And this is not like, it's not the perfect solution. So it's really interesting to see how some of these things will just come natively to Canton. And it's stuff like this that we are really excited to start tapping into. Um, I think also we're already seeing now like some of these very big like repo use cases, right? A lot of backend settlement use cases. So I think like once we then bring like a lot of stuff for them to do on chain from Ethereum, I'm sure that we can find like new things coming up with how we can engage with these types of like new on-chain assets.
Yeah, makes sense. And speaking about the more, this is kind of the long-term overview of what you're expecting to be happening on the network. And if we imagine that you have the mainnet launch, what will be the success for Zenith after the launch?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, like in the first phase, it's us getting like a lot of these DeFi teams to launch and deploy in Zenith and build up like the ecosystem there from like from the ground up, right? I think one of the things that we have, which is also like really nice to work with this, is that I think like a lot of ones and L2s, they have this like very generalized approach to their ecosystem, right? It's just do everything a little bit, right? Where like I think on Zenith we have like a very clear focus, right? I think we're seeing, some teams kind of like starting to have this a little bit more clear focus, right? But I think, if we go back a few years, it was this like very generalized approach. So we have a very clear focus on kind of institutional adoption of DeFi and Zenith. So of course, the success for us would then be when we're actually able to make this happen, right? So we are working on some really interesting solutions around native DeFi liquidity coming in. So, the success for me, of course, like billions of dollars and all of this stuff would be very nice in TVL, and, everything would be amazing. But I think if I'm looking at kind of like more like the granular level, it's really to have use cases happening where we have like large financial institutions or traditional companies who is coming in and then partnering with a DeFi technology, partnering with DeFi native liquidity, and then basically making a use case happen where we use kind of like native DeFi rails to optimize their setup and also get liquidity natively from DeFi. So that's some of the stuff that I'm like really excited about working with. But of course, in the beginning, we need the teams there. Fortunately, we have a lot of interest, right? We have a crazy inbound pipeline, and I'm in touch with all the major EVM teams. And there's a lot of interest to launch. So hopefully the first phase will be okay. But then, yeah, like the next step is really kind of like growing this ecosystem from scratch. And this is something we're not taking lightly neither. Of course, we have seen a lot of chain launches over the years that hasn't done particularly well. But I think like with our approach and our like crystal clear focus, this is something that we are able to overcome. And then, yeah, like basically starting to really push, these, kind of like more structured deals where we work with multiple DeFi teams and big institutions, and then do really cool use cases with them. Um, so yeah, I know it was like a bit of a broad answer, but of course, I think like in a launch there is like kind of different phases we go through, right? And of course, we have to kind of like take it step by step. But yeah, so after 6 months, it is to have multiple of these more structured use cases live, and a lot of volume and activity and applications, just like a lot of things to do. And of course, also make sure that things are being done.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thanks for sharing. Any other bold moves to expect from Zenith this year?
I mean, we have a lot in the pipeline, but I think for like a lot of it, well, you're gonna have to wait and see a bit. So I think we have some really cool approaches to adoption and pushing and growing the ecosystem. So yeah, but we're not quite showing our hand yet.
Okay, so a lot of hidden alpha to see from Zenith team coming in. Okay, thank you. That's been Gustav from Zenith for Canton Insiders. I think it's your whether first or second interview representing the Zenith team. So yeah, thanks for joining me. For everyone listening, you can find the Zenith at zenith.network, and I will also link Gustav's LinkedIn account in the description. So let's see where and how the DeFi and institutional finance will cooperate in the future, and how Zenith Canton will support it. And this was Canton Insiders, brought to you by Catholics by Intellect EU. We'll be back really soon with another one. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gustav.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.